Welcome everybody. We've got 15 people on this webinar so far, and you'll find that you've been muted unless you're one of the presenters. There will be an opportunity at the end of the webinar for you to ask questions, and we'd ask people to write your questions in the chat as you think of them, and Anne from our office, who's on the line, will moderate those questions and at the end of the presentations put some of those questions to each of our three presenters. So welcome to this Catholic Social Services webinar concerning the End Child Poverty Campaign. My name is Ron Johnson. I'm the Acting Executive Director of Catholic Social Services Australia. And I'd like to start by acknowledging and paying respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we work and live, who long before us lived, loved and raised their children on this land. We acknowledge their physical and spiritual connections to their land, their stories, traditions and living cultures. We acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families in our community and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I am joining you from the land of the Ngunnawal people today in Canberra. So as I said, this is a special webinar concerning the End Child Poverty Campaign. And we've got three presenters today. Our first speaker is Mr. Tony Pietropiccolo from the End Child Poverty Campaign. And I'll just read out a brief biography for Tony before handing over to him to give his presentation. Tony's commitment and achievements in the social services sector span close to 50 years. He is a registered psychologist and was appointed to his current position as Director of Centrecare in 1989. That's Centrecare in Western Australia. Tony has been a member of the former Centrecare Australia Board, the Catholic Social Welfare Commission, and the Western Australian Catholic Education Commission. He has been WACOS President, Co-Chair of Community Employers WA, Vice President of the FRSA, a board member of ACOS, and a member of the National Child Protection Forum, to name a few. Tony is currently a board member of community housing provider Stellar Living and the Equity Project WA. In 2016, Tony founded the Valuing Children Initiative, VCI. VCI aims to raise awareness about the value of children and the importance of creating a society where they can flourish. In 2018, Tony became concerned about the high level of child poverty in Australia and the lack of action to resolve it. Since then, he has written and presented papers on the topic and resolved to work towards establishing a legislated response to child poverty and formed a national leadership group to participate in that work. In April 2024, together with the VCI team led by Sarah Quinton, the End Child Poverty Campaign was launched. Tony's achievements have been recognised with his appointment as a member of the Order of Australia in the General Division AM in 2012, as a finalist in the 2023 WA of the Year Awards, and as an adjunct professor at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, Fremantle campus. Tony, over to you, mate. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Ron. Good morning to everybody. I think it's nice. It's still good morning or good afternoon over in the East, isn't it? Anyway, welcome. And of course, I want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we all are, and want to acknowledge especially their elders, past, present, and emerging. Well, as Ron said, the End Child Poverty Campaign came out of our concern for children and their well-being. I was on the National Child Protection Forum. That forum is the one that puts together the child protection action plans for Australia. And I was on that for 10 years. During that period, I began to understand and realize that despite everyone's best efforts, the level of child abuse and neglect in Australia was not abating. In fact, it was on the rise. The recent maltreatment study undertaken by the Australian Catholic University shows just how dire the situation is in relation to child maltreatment in this country. But as a consequence of that, I thought that, well, my view was at the time, and it still is, that unless we changed our view of children in Australia, and unless we began to value them more as a community, not just as individuals with our own kids, then the chances of children being able to thrive in this country was highly limited. Because it's my belief that if we value something, we actually look after it. We actually do things that are important to their well-being. And so the Valuing Children initiative came out of that thinking and out of that view, rightly or wrongly. When we first began BCI, there was almost, we had to explain what was it, what were we trying to do. People can get their head around of the whole concept of valuing children even. But after now 7 years of this work, funded by Centrecare in Perth, I think the message about the value of children, the valuing of children, is beginning to resonate with a lot of people. And we've seen it creeping into a host of different reports. And we're very encouraged by that. The End Child Poverty campaign was just a natural follow-on from that. Having realized that in 2018 that we hadn't spoken about child poverty in Australia for decades. We talk about the marginalised, we talk about low socioeconomic groups, we use a whole host of different descriptions, but we've rarely talked about child poverty in Australia for a long, long time. And at a presentation on the New Zealand Child Poverty Reduction Act at a conference 2018, it stirred my interest and looked into child poverty a bit and realised that we were talking about nearly 1 million children in Australia live in child poverty. But then when you looked a bit further, you realised the enormous impact that child poverty has on a child's well-being, both as children, but also in terms of their future possibilities and their physical and emotional well-being. So mental health, physical health, future prospects, high level of possibility that they will themselves experience, like their parents, poverty for the rest of their lives. It seemed to me that in a country like Australia, as rich as it is, to have such a situation was quite difficult to believe. Compared to OECD countries, Australia is percentage of children in poverty is much higher. OECD average is around 9 to 10%. Australia currently is close to 17%. I would suggest that at the moment with the cost of living issues around the country, that percentage would at least be 17%. So internationally, we're not doing well. Denmark has got a child poverty rate of 3%. Australia in 1990s, early 1990s, had a child poverty rate of 8%. The Hawke Labor government had brought that down to 8% from 14% over a period of 14 years, which suggests that governments can do something practical and worthwhile about it. It can actually do something that will make a difference to kids' lives, but it is about political will. There's no doubt that without governments intervening, it's unlikely that child poverty will abate. Hawke proved that. And the reason why we've gone from 8% to 17% over the intervening period has largely been because of government policy direction and changes. That's been the main driver of the increase in child poverty, and it is up to government to do something about it. But government won't do anything about it unless there's a community demand for that to happen. Child poverty remains largely invisible in Australia. When I talk to people that aren't in our sector and I say to them that the level of child poverty is significant in Australia, tell them the stats, most people can't believe it. The recent report by Australia Institute on that they surveyed the attitudes of Australians, 1,000 Australians or more, towards their belief around child poverty, whether or not government should do something about child poverty, was 80+% support for addressing child poverty in this country. So the general population are supportive, want to do something about child poverty because they see that children don't have the capacity to do it themselves. They don't have the power to do it themselves. They rely on us adults to do something about their situation. And I think we as adults have a responsibility to do something about that. We can't just sit back and say, well, it's all too hard, or we can't do anything about it, or, you know, the poor are always with us, as some people will say. And so what's the point? It's that children have a right to a decent life. And we can't just turn away from that. We can't turn away from that. As adults, you know, from a moral perspective, forget about the economics of it. There's a lot of economic studies that show that it makes a lot more sense to do something about child poverty than not to do about child poverty, because you save a heap of money in the long term by doing something positive about child poverty and reducing it or ending it. But we're choosing not to. So knowing the consequences of child poverty from a moral perspective, and the research is significant on this. It's not as if something that still needs to be proven in terms of psychological impact. The long-term impact on people's well-being generally is there. So we know that it has a very negative impact on children and their long-term life. So we know that. We also know that we have the means to do something about it. We know that too, as a community. We have the wealth. We have the knowledge. So a society that then doesn't do anything about it, or we, as responsible citizens, don't do anything about it, the conclusion is that we are choosing not to do something about it and choosing to leave children in a state that is unhealthy and unacceptable in a moral sense. And the question that is in front of each adult in this country is, what are we individually and collectively willing to do about that? So the End Child Poverty campaign is trying to provide a vehicle through which we can express what we want to see happen in this country in relation to child poverty, and in maximising the possibilities of our kids. Because there is a cost to not doing anything about child poverty, not just to them personally, but also to the community as a whole. And I think Ron has asked me to perhaps refer some to Catholic social teachings on this. When I look through the many principles of Catholic social teachings, but especially there are so many of them that relate to this work. Um, you know, it relates to the dignity of the human person. It relates to the options for the poor. It relates to the fact that we have responsibility to the common good, not to just an individual good. It talks about the importance of rights and responsibilities. That people have a right to see through certain things, and children have a right. The principle of economic justice is equally important. And I think that when we look at our work, and our work in social services is one where we're trying to alleviate the difficulties that people face. And I've been in this work for a long time, as Ron has mentioned to you. And I think service delivery is essential in Australia. But we also have a responsibility to do something about the cause of those things that we then have to help people with. And we also have to look upstream as to why is it that we have such high levels of children that are suicidal? Why is it that we have so many children in our community that struggle with depression? Why is it that we have so many children in out-of-home care? Why is it that we have so many children that are maltreated in this country? We have to ask these questions. We cannot just keep picking up pieces. I attended the United Nations Commission on the Rights of the Child meeting in Geneva, must have been about 4 or 5 years ago. And one of the things that really came home to me at that meeting, because Australia had to, go before the Commission to provide a report, was that whenever the commissioners presented an issue to the Australian bureaucrats, the answer was always, well, we have a service for that. What I was picking up from the commissioners was that they wanted to hear what was the spirit behind what Australia was trying to do. What was Australia's spirit towards the well-being of children? What was Australia's vision for children? What were we trying to do as a community about children? Not that here we have a problem. Oh, yes, we have a problem, but here's the solution. This is the service we're providing. We're not resolving the issue of why are children in this state in Australia today, okay? So for me, the Valuing Children Initiative and the End Child Poverty Campaign are attempts to try and answer the whys and attempts to deal with some of the fundamental reasons why children experience the things that they do in our country. And I'm encouraged by the fact that Pope Francis introduced the first ever World Children's Day within the Catholic calendar, and that took place in Rome in May. And his view on children, describing them as a source of joy, and that they represent every person's desire to grow and flourish. And his view that we have a responsibility to them and to create a better world for them. But I think what was of very great interest to me was that he actually called on the kids and I quote from him, "Our world would change if we all begin with these little things," and he was referring to little acts of kindness, "without being ashamed to take small steps one at a time." But I think those small steps relate to us adults as well. We have to have the courage to take the small steps to create a better world for our kids. And I'll just leave it at that, and an encouragement to you to actually to help us in what we're trying to do, but also to take on your own ways of trying to create a better society for our children. So thanks, Ron.
Thank you very much, Tony, for that excellent overview and encouragement. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Sharon Bessell, and Sharon is a professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. Sharon is the director of the Children's Policy Centre and co-host of Policy Forum Pod. Sharon is currently leading More for Children, a program of research aimed at creating child-inclusive societies and developing child-centred framework for understanding, assessing and responding to multidimensional poverty. The current phase of More for Children is funded by the Paul Ramsay Foundation and involves rights-based research with children, their families and communities. Sharon has worked on social policy for children in Australia and globally, and is internationally recognised as a leading scholar in the field. Over to you, and thanks very much for your time today, Sharon.
Hi, Ron. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share some of the research that we're doing at the Children's Policy Centre at the Australian National University. I'm just going to share my screen, and of course, this is the moment of truth when we find out if the technology is going to be our friend. I'm sure it is. Can I just check, Ron, that you can see that screen, and then I'll just
Yes.
enlarge it.
All very good, Sharon. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you. So thanks again for this opportunity. I'm joining from the beautiful and unceded lands of the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people in Canberra, here on the ANU's campus. The research that I'm going to be talking about today has taken place on the lands of the Yorta Yorta people and on Lutruwita, Tasmania, which is my home place. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any Indigenous people that might be joining us today. And as Ron did earlier, I want to acknowledge just how much there is to learn from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia about how to care for children, how to connect them to country and to community. I did want to begin by just acknowledging the fabulous team at the Children's Policy Centre that's behind this research. Megan, Adele Chenoweth and Heather Fitter online today, and so is Dr. Kayla O'Sullivan. Kayla's an extraordinary researcher who's been doing this research with me, and so I particularly wanted to acknowledge Kayla. And we're also grateful to our partners and to the Ramsay Foundation for funding this research. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about the recent history of child poverty in Australia, and Tony's already started to map some of this, and to talk a little bit about the policy choices that have been made. And then I wanted to share with you some of the things that children have told us about what it's like to grow up in poverty, and to help us to think about what we need to do. And I do want to thank every child who's participated in our research with incredible honesty and with incredible hope. And finally, I want to say a little bit about what we must do to begin to reduce and to ultimately end child poverty in this very wealthy country. So I'm sure that everyone in the room knows the headline statistic that Tony mentioned earlier, and knows that statistic very well. 1 in 6 children under the age of 15 in Australia live in income poverty. In some parts of Australia, that figure is much higher. In one of the communities that we've been working in, 40% of children live in income poverty. These are shocking figures. And it's these figures that have led to the need for and the importance of a national campaign to end child poverty. So let me just go a little bit back into the policy history around thinking about child poverty, because we haven't always had a situation where child poverty hasn't been a national priority. By the late 1990s, Australia was regarded as having made considerable progress in reducing child poverty, and was favourably compared with countries like the United Kingdom and the United States. We were emerging as a global leader in addressing child poverty through a more generous approach to allowances and to tax benefits, supplements for low-income families to help meet the cost of living, increases in family payments, and importantly, linking those payments to wage growth and providing rent assistance to low-income families. All of these things played a really important role. And this progress came in the wake of Bob Hawke's now famous pledge to reduce child poverty during the 1987 election campaign. And subsequent policy decisions had a marked impact. You can see on the chart in front of you the decline in child poverty based on 50% of median income after housing from the late 1990s through to about 2003. And then you can also see the poverty rose sharply from just over 14% in 2003 to just over 18% in 2007. The rise in child poverty during this period resulted largely from lower benefits and conditionality imposed on sole parent families in particular, as well as changes to family tax benefits for low-income families. Child poverty rates for households reliant on government benefits rose from 25% in 1993 to 66% in 2017. And for the decade after 2009, child poverty sat at just under 18%. My colleague here at the Crawford School, Peter Whiteford, pointed out in 2017 that the previous 12 years of governments under 5 different prime ministers, both coalition and Labor, had made explicit decisions to cut assistance to low-income families. Low-income single parents were most severely affected, and welfare conditionality worsened the situation for single parents in particular. So what we see here are a range of policy decisions that impacted directly on children's experiences of poverty and the extent of child poverty. As we all know, in 2020, amongst a lot of bad news, we also saw a good news story. Child poverty rose as a result of COVID-19 responses, but then it dropped markedly as a result of the coronavirus supplements. But that good news quickly turned sour. When those supplements were removed, the downward shift in child poverty reversed. And so policy choices matter. We as a nation choose how much child poverty we're prepared to tolerate, accept, or even expect. We are currently finding ourselves in a situation where different policy choices are emerging, and I think we need to acknowledge and support that. We've seen some positive decisions taken by the current federal government, including changes to conditionality, particularly Parents Next, and the change in eligibility for single parent payment, increasing the age of the youngest child. In the past few years, we've also seen the federal government commit to tackling entrenched disadvantage. We've seen increased commitment to our youngest children through the National Early Years Strategy, and we've seen increasing interest in promoting wellbeing nationally through the Measuring What Matters framework and in a number of states. So this is all very important, but reforms need to go much, much further. And I also wanted to make 3 points here. First, excuse me, I'm just going to take a sip of water as I put my slideshow back on. So to make 3 points. First, a focus on ending disadvantage is welcome and essential, but we need to name poverty and to respond to it in ways that don't blame individuals, but recognise the structural causes and recognise where systems are failing children and their families. Second, we need to scaffold wellbeing by ending child poverty. In developing any measure, be it of wellbeing or of poverty, we need to ensure that we measure in a way that's child-centred and that we measure not for measurement's sake, but as a basis for action. And third, supporting the early years is absolutely essential. The evidence for the importance of investing in the first 2,000 days of life is absolutely compelling. But we need to continue to support children and families beyond the first 1,000 or 2,000 days. And at present, we're creating a policy and service cliff. The good and increasing support that's being given to the early years is incredibly important. And we're also seeing some good policies for young people as they move towards the end of secondary school and towards adulthood and employment. But there is very limited support for families and for children in the middle years. Too often we expect schools to do it all, and schools can't do it all. So I wanted to turn now, having kind of sketched out that kind of policy landscape, to talk a little bit about the research that we're doing at the Children's Policy Centre with children and with their families and their communities. The children and young people who have participated in the More for Children research, which aims to understand and to end child poverty, have been aged between 6 and 16, but the vast amount of the participants have been aged between 6 and 12, that period of middle childhood. We use rights-based and participatory and child-centred activities to understand complex issues, and poverty is a very complex issue from a child standpoint. We aim to understand what it is like for children to live in poverty and how we can best respond. And response is important. It would be immoral to research child poverty without aiming to act to end it. In our research with children about poverty, we hear what matters to children. We listen to their individual stories and their experiences and to their ideas for what would make life good for them and for all children whose families are struggling. And we know today that too many families are really struggling. From children's individual stories, we draw our common themes, and children's experiences of poverty, we are finding, are disturbingly similar. But this means that there are responses to child poverty. This is not a problem that has no solution. And from those common themes, we're developing frameworks and tools to understand, to assess, and most importantly, to respond to child poverty in ways that are child-centred. And so what have children told us? What have we heard from children? We've heard about the challenges of not having enough food, of being cold in winter, of living in overcrowded, mouldy and unsafe houses. We hear from children what it's like to live in a caravan, in a tent or in a car, because there's nowhere else to go. And I'm sure many people online have heard these stories too. We hear children describe how poverty limits their hopes, and we hear about the stress that poverty places on parents who are stressed, angry, and desperate. Children share their fears that when they grow up, they won't find jobs and houses, that they won't earn enough money, that their lives will be as hard as adults as it is now in their childhoods. And we also hear about the love that children have for their parents and parents' love for them, and about the ways that families cope and protect one another. And we hear from children, often very young children, about the way they try to protect and support their parents. The poster that you can now see on your screen was drawn by an 11-year-old girl who describes the things that children need. She listed the essentials that we might hope the children don't need to worry about, but she did have to worry because her family had been homeless for months. And she also said that a butterfly garden alongside cheaper essential items, kitchen appliances, bedding and a pillow would be lovely to have. Our research involves listening deeply and respectfully to children whose experiences, ideas and priorities, whose standpoints are often missed. This image is drawn by a 12-year-old girl, and it captures so powerfully the importance of listening. And as Tony said, we often fail to listen to children, but particularly we fail to listen to children whose lives are hard. The children that we do research with often have very little opportunity to talk about the things that matter to them and to have their views taken seriously. Based on what children have told us, we've developed a child-centred definition of poverty. Poverty is the interplay between key non-material and material deprivations. It means children do not have the material basics, their opportunities are limited, and critical relationships are either not in place or are under pressure. There is a material core to poverty, But for children, poverty extends beyond that material poor. And from the work that we've done with children, what we've heard of their experiences, we've developed a three-dimensional framework, the MORE framework, M-O-R, through which to assess, understand and respond to child poverty. There are three dimensions: material, opportunity and relational. And I just briefly wanted to share with you what children have said about each of these dimensions. The material dimension is about the basics: having enough food, a house to live in, being warm, and being able to go to the places you need to get to. Children talk about the high cost of living, the challenges of affording the essentials, such as petrol and food, and a place to live in. You can see on the bottom poster, a young boy said that if he were able to make decisions, he'd make the price of gas go down because it's hard for his family to get around. I should just add here too, you'll see that we've named the children and their ages. Bananas isn't a real person. Or bananas isn't a real name, I should say. We asked children at the beginning of the research to identify a research nickname. So when we share what they've said, they know that they're their ideas, but we maintain children's confidentiality. I'd also encourage you, as you look at these images that I'm going to share, to take note of the ages of some of the children and the comments that they've made. So children also describe what's missing in their lives, or what their lives are like when the material basics are missing. We hear about what it's like when there's just not enough money to pay the rent, to pay for the groceries, to pay for petrol, and how that impacts on children's lives. Children have described the opportunities that they need, or as an 11-year-old boy put it, the chance to do the things that matter. And they've also described the way in which their opportunities are limited by poverty. Children describe being able to do very little, of not being able to do the things that we would want children to be able to do, to play, to learn, to be connected with their communities. As the quote on the screen in front of you indicates, we often hear from children, as Max said, that it's often just sitting at home because there's no money to do anything. We also heard from children that they need places to play. They need places that are friendly and welcoming to them. And as Jordan said, it shouldn't cost money to have fun. We invite children to write a message to the adults who make decisions on behalf of children. And one girl wrote, "Dear Prime Minister Anthony, please give children with no opportunity some hope." A 10-year-old boy described his worries about what he described as bad things of the future. He worried about not finding a job or a house. He worried that life would continue to be unbearably hard. He worried that his life as an adult would be as it's been while he's a child. When we ask what is important, children almost always start with the people who matter to them, the relationships they value, and families, particularly parents, are almost always at the centre. But children also talk about the stress that poverty puts on relationships. Poverty creates tension and pressure. Here we see Barry talking about the way his mum and dad fight when his dad's stressed about money. We do hear children talking about drug use. We hear children talking about alcohol when parents are struggling, or when adults are struggling to find ways to cope themselves. And that beautiful quote at the bottom where we asked, "What makes life good with mum?" And the response, "Nothing. I just like hugging her." Relationships are fundamentally important to children, and I just wanted to say a little bit more about this. We need to better understand and acknowledge how social and economic structures and systems foster strong and supportive relationships for children, or fail to do so. Strong, caring relationships can act as a buffer to protect children, but poverty eats away at those relationships. And I wanted to just give you a couple of examples of how Economic and social pressures damage relationships. And these examples are both from mums, and we interviewed parents as well as children in this research. One mum spoke of her adored 8-year-old child, but she also spoke of being able to give her so little of what she needs, of often being short of food, in fear of homelessness, and she talked about the insecurity she faces daily. She said in despair, "I sometimes wonder if it would be better if she went into foster care. But the one thing that stops me is that I know no one can love her the way I love her." This is an incredibly powerful example of how poverty undermines relationships. Another mum described being on the phone to Centrelink for hours, of listening to that very annoying music that drives us all crazy. She was listening to it as she was desperate because her benefits had been cut. She spoke of being told when someone finally picked up the phone that they couldn't help. She talked about her desperation. And she described how she raced from that phone call to pick up her son from school. And she talked about her guilt when he began in excitement to describe his day at school. And she, still angry and frustrated from that phone call, told him to shut up. She was still carrying that guilt weeks later, but it was the systems that were failing her. Systems play a very significant part in all of this. Parents tell us about what one called writing the soul-destroying letters, about saying that their children might be at risk in order to receive more hours of subsidised after-school care. One mum described her exhaustion after spending all day trying to find affordable food. It's hard for parents to be there for their children when our social structures and systems place them under so much pressure that they're running on empty themselves. And this is what we highlight when we talk about relational deprivation. So the MORE framework gives us a child-centred way of understanding the multidimensional nature of child poverty, of identifying and addressing the underlying causes, and scaffolding well-being for all children. And well-being for all children simply can't be achieved while child poverty continues. For children, as I said earlier, poverty is about a lack of income, but it's also fundamentally multidimensional. This poster by a 10-year-old girl who called herself Mr. Potato describes the multidimensionality of poverty very powerfully. She talks about food and water, but she also talks about a home and friends. And we need to address each critical dimension of poverty if we are to successfully reduce child poverty. Not each of the dimensions that I've outlined here are in and of themselves necessarily an indicator of poverty, except perhaps the material dimension, which does indicate income poverty. But when we see the overlap between these dimensions, we see multidimensional poverty, and often very deep poverty. A 12-year-old boy whose family was experiencing homelessness, who was often hungry, but tried his hardest to support his mum, described his life as follows. He said, "Okay, when life is tough at home, it's anger, heartbroken, feels like pain is in the air. Devastation is everywhere. You can see it through people's eyes. It's so frustrating. It just happens sometimes in life. It just hurts. It hits you in a way you don't want it to. It normally causes people to argue. You get hurt or no one helps you. It hurts you inside." This boy also described his anger and his pain when he and his mum went to a food charity to ask food and were told that, or his mum was told that she'd better have a good reason for coming so regularly because she'd been every day that week. So as this time for me to share some of this with you draws to an end, I just wanted to share with you what our research with children tells us about the things that we need to do, the kinds of shifts that we need to make to end child poverty and what needs to happen at all levels of society. And I want to talk just briefly about communities, about services, and about government. Communities can be incredibly supportive for children when they are built around child-friendly places and child-friendly attitudes. But too often we see the exclusion of children. Communities matter when they're sites of connection and care. And when these things are in place, communities can become places that provide children with opportunities to participate and to develop inter- and intragenerational relationships. Communities can provide support to children and their families when things are tough. And yet, many, I think most, of the children who've participated in our research have no connection with their communities and no support from them. So we need to seriously begin to build child-inclusive communities. People in this room are far better placed than I am to talk about the ways in which services and service providers can promote material well-being, opportunities, and strong relationships for children. From what we've heard from children, service providers are essential in providing food and with help for housing. One 12-year-old girl said, "My family just couldn't survive without the help of a local organisation that regularly provides them with food." But it's also important that service providers recognise and respect a child's standpoint and understand that children's experiences may not be fully known by their families, and that supporting parents may not always equate to supporting children. And it's incredibly important to think about how service providers respond to children and their families. Remember that example I gave of Max, whose mum, while he was standing next to her, was told that she was seeking help too often. Service providers have an essential role in fostering children's connections, in supporting and advocating for the things that we need to ensure that children have opportunities, such as child-friendly communities and greater educational equity. Service providers have a key role in challenging structures and systems that create relational deprivation. On these things, we must speak up. It's important that the pressures children face are recognised and treated as seriously as the pressures that their children face. And so for service providers to tackle child poverty head on, child-centred and child-inclusive practices are critical. And I think it's also important to recognise the difference between the two. Child-inclusive policies and practices are those that don't position children as the primary focus, but ensure that children's needs, rights and interests are recognised as one primary focus amongst others. And children are identified as stakeholders, key stakeholders, in policy processes and outcomes. Child-centred policies and practice place children's needs, human rights and interests as the primary focus and include children in decision-making, and achieving positive outcomes for children is the explicit priority. We may not always be child-centred, and sometimes that might not be appropriate, but we should always be child-inclusive. And this moves children to the status of citizens with entitlements and rights. And finally, what role for government? In terms of preventing and reducing material poverty, redistribution, higher levels of income support that ensure that people are not living below the poverty line, and social housing are all essential. In terms of expanding opportunities for children who are living in contexts of poverty, policies and funding models around education are critical. Education equity and child-centred education are essential if we're to make serious inroads into multidimensional child poverty and address the intergenerational entrenchment of poverty. And I could spend far more time than we have talking about educational inequity, the kinds of inequity that will continue regardless of the efforts of individual teachers and schools if the system isn't working. Also essential is child-friendly planning, creating communities that are child-inclusive, safe and welcoming places for children to live and play. We need to build footpaths so children can easily and safely get around. We need communal, child-inclusive spaces to bring people together across generations. And we need child-friendly services close to home. Some communities may be developed in this way, but many are not. And as we begin to build more social housing, which is urgently needed, it's important that child-friendly principles are at the forefront. We need to at least be child inclusive and ideally child-centred. If not, we'll create housing that is not fit for children, which will be with us for generations to come and will keep the conditions for maintaining child poverty. And finally, over recent decades, there has across Australia been a pattern of negative narratives that are about individual blaming and shaming. This is starting to shift, and it's shifting quite fast, but an attitudinal legacy is likely to remain around the deserving and the undeserving poor, and that's destructive and it needs to change. Removing punitive conditionality from welfare is essential, and we're starting to see, as I said, some positive movement. Placing care and wellbeing at the centre of government policies and funding is a step forward towards ending the structural barriers and systems that erode supportive relationships for children. There are some very practical measures that governments can adopt. First, child-centred assessment of poverty as a basis for action. And I hope, or we hope at the Children's Policy Centre, that the work I've mapped today contributes to that. We also need child rights impact statements. We need to think seriously about an Act for Children that the National Children's Commissioner is advocating, and we need child-centred budgeting. If we'd taken a child-centred analysis of COVID-19 responses using something like the Moore framework, it would have been impossible to remove the coronavirus supplements because we would have understood what a negative impact that would have on children. But we do need transformative thinking about how we place children, care, connection, and community at the centre of policy decisions. More of the same will simply abandon children to a life that feels like pain is in the air. And so from our research with children, we know the dimensions of poverty that matter, and we can see clear strategies for ending child poverty. The next steps in our work are to develop a set of child-centred indicators within the Moore framework, to develop a place-based toolkit that's child-centred to support communities and local service providers to identify what they can do to end child poverty in ways that are genuinely child-centred, and to develop a policy design and assessment framework with the aim of contributing to policies that act to end, not to perpetuate or deepen child poverty. And we're always looking for partners to join us in this journey. So please get in touch if you would like to be part of that journey. And so to summarise, what our research is aiming to contribute is a child standpoint on poverty that uncovers and illuminates children's experiences in order to support child-centred understanding of and responses to multidimensional poverty, and to support child-centred policies and services that reduce child poverty. Through this, we believe that we can together create a society that is genuinely child inclusive, and to ensure that no child in this very wealthy country lives in poverty. We've just released 2 reports on children's experiences of poverty and one on methodology. They're on our website, and you see our web address on the page in front of you. And thank you so much for the opportunity to share this research with you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Sharon Bessell from the Australian National University Children's Policy Centre. That was a brilliant presentation and very much appreciated. It's obviously extremely important work that you're engaged in. I don't think I can think of anything more important for academics and practitioners and social justice people to be working on. So thank you very much. Just a reminder, we've got 26 participants on this webinar, and we've got our final speaker coming up in a moment. Just a reminder to type your questions into the chat if you've got a question for any of our presenters. And Anne, our communications director at CWSA, will read out your questions for the presenters to consider. Now, I might add that on this hookup, we've got people from St Francis Social Services, Jesuit Social Services, Centrecare Geraldton, Catholic Care Western Sydney in the Blue Mountains, Marist 180, Catholic Care Wilcannia Forbes, Catholic Care Toowoomba, Catholic Care Social Services New South Wales and the ACT. We've got Baptist Care Australia, Robin Sampson, and plenty of others, including Tony Wren and Professor Maria Harries. Welcome, everyone. And welcome also to those whose names I didn't read out. Now, our next speaker is Sarah Quinton. Sarah is the Development Executive and for the End Child Poverty campaign. Sarah is a former journalist turned political campaigner, community organiser and communication specialist. Sarah has championed children's voices in areas like public education, mental health and homelessness. And Sarah's commitment to empowering children's voices is instrumental in driving systemic change. So over to you, Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Sharon. Thank you for holding this wonderful event. Sharon, that was absolutely incredible. I think what's been very difficult in terms of our view of trying to campaign for change is not having the voice of children. So having your work and the work that Kayla and the team have done this is the watershed moment for us, now having those voices and the voices of parents so that we can campaign and get real systemic change for children and families. I'm on beautiful Wujak Noongar Buja today, and I always acknowledge the Noongar people, who are a very strong community of people who base all of their values within their children and their families. And the Noongar word for children is koolingas. So we also acknowledge the koolingas that we do this work for, and we endorse their rights under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Children. And we always say that everything that we do to our children is that you are valued and that you matter. So Sharon has talked a lot about what it is that children need and want. Tony has talked a lot about why we need to be doing this. Today, I'm going to be talking about how we're going to achieve what it is that we want to achieve. Can everyone see my screen? It's always difficult with these. Oh, people are saying no. Why? What have I done? What if I do? Now? Oh, Laurie, you're going to have to come and help me. What have I done? Do I have to do it here? This. What do you mean? Yep. Yep. Yep.
Yep, we can see your screen now, Sarah. All good.
Right. It wasn't you, Sharon. It was me that was going to have the technical moment. Okay, so this is our child poverty campaign. Like Tony said, we launched this in April. We did a lot of groundwork before that. We developed a leadership committee, of which Sharon is on, to make sure that the things that we are asking for and the messages we are using is what the community has long been saying about child poverty. So we wanted to make sure that who we were doing this for and why we were doing this and what it is, what was the ask we wanted to achieve. When I came into this position, almost the first conversation Tony had with me was, I want to introduce the Child Poverty Reduction Act. Great, I'm your girl. Let's get this done. So we immediately started to organise the campaign. We have spoken to people who have introduced Child Poverty Reduction Acts around the world. We held a webinar last year with the Schuyler Centre, who have introduced Child Poverty Reduction Act in New York. I have spoken to the crew in Canada. They don't have a Child Poverty Reduction Act. They have a Poverty Reduction Act. And we've spoken to the crew in New Zealand, and Jacinda Ardern did ring me, and we had a long chat about the way New Zealand introduced their Child Poverty Reduction Act. So we wanted to make sure that we were getting what we wanted to. We had long conversations, and this is where we have landed with our theory of change. So we agree that if we have 500 organisations with us from across the nation, and we elevate the voices of children across the nation and their parents about the impact of child poverty and how the systems are affecting and contributing to their poverty, if we have those voices with us, the government cannot ignore us in getting what we want. So we are at about 107 organisations now. We want 500 by the election next year, or maybe it's going to be this year. After the election, we'll be going very hard and delivering our message to government, to the federal government. So we're going to pool our resources, we're going to hold events, we're going to hold workshops, and we're going to tell everyone and raise the issue of child poverty in Australia. A lot of people are in denial about child poverty, as Tony said. So we frame it this way, that for every 100 Australian children, 17 of them are experiencing poverty. Which 17 kids do we choose out of this? Many of you in the service sector probably already know a lot of these statistics, but children living in single parent families have a poverty rate of 39%, which is more around the figures that Sharon was telling us with those communities that she spoke to. Around 40% of those children are experiencing those forms of poverty. And more than 8 in 10 of single parents aged 25 to 54 reported challenges of paying for food, housing, utility, and or health, higher than any other family type. So our focus has to be families, which is what Sharon talked about as child inclusive. And this is where we're going. So what are our campaign goals? Legislation. If we get legislation for a Child Poverty Reduction Act, we have won our campaign, but it won't be the end of our campaign. So a Child Poverty Reduction Act has very few elements that seem simple but are quite complicated. The biggest and hardest part is measuring child poverty. The statistics that we have here are quite old, a few years old, some from ACOS and New South Wales data. I'm starting to prepare some media for Homelessness Week next week, and journalists are asking me for up-to-date information on children experiencing homelessness, and all I can give them is ABS data that is now 5 years old. So the issue is we are not measuring child poverty in Australia. In fact, we don't even have a definition, an agreed definition of child poverty. So that's what we need to do. We need a legislation that will define child poverty and the rate and how we will define that in economic terms. And then we need to work out a way of measuring child poverty. The way they do it in New Zealand is through a survey. Some other countries do it in terms of a basket of goods. In fact, the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence has an expert coming over in a couple of weeks, and she has worked with 150 countries on how to measure child poverty. So this is a very interesting time for us to be talking about child poverty. It is very much on the political radar, given we are in a cost of living and housing crisis in this nation. So what is it that is going to measure our campaign? Well, it's our petition signatures. We need as many as possible, which shows our community support. So please share the petition link that Julie has put in the chat. Please get all your staff to sign it. Please get everyone in your community to sign it. This is what will show the community support. The other measure is, like I said, our campaign organisation partners. So we have, like I said, around 107. We want 500. That will show to the government that this isn't just Sarah and Tony and Sharon sitting in our offices speaking to avoid. This is saying we have this many organisations with us calling for this legislation. And so if you haven't pledged, it's very simple. You can just send us your logo, or you can fill in the form. Make sure you send us your logo. But it's not just about sending your logo. It's about committing and doing something for the campaign. Hold a webinar like this, hold an event with your staff, collect stories of your families and children, get media. Next year, when we start talking to the government, we're going to be calling upon you to do that. We are going to be calling upon you to go and visit your Member of Parliament and say you want a Child Poverty Reduction Act in this country, because child poverty is unacceptable. So like I said, 107 partners. This is just a small snapshot. I think Julie's probably put the link in there about all of the campaign partners that we have so far. And down the track, these are the actions that we want all of you to contribute to. So communication, spread the word, tell your community that we have child poverty, that it is undeniable and it exists, and that 17 out of 100 children are living in poverty and living in the kinds of poverty that Sharon has articulated today. Hold an event. We're happy to hold events for you, more like this, and I'll take you through some others, and doing a workshop. So the storytelling and personal narratives is what Sharon has done through research. And there are very ethical ways that you can do this by de-identifying and making sure that these children are telling their stories in a safe way. Perhaps Sharon can get in touch with you. I know Sharon has offered to come to Western Australia and do a workshop for us with some children here. So that's an opportunity we will be taking her up on to come to WA and talk to some of the West Australian children to tell their stories. And spread the word. Get it all over your social media. This is our staff, some people from our board, and we've put this all over the media. Here's an ABC story we ran.
There's a push for Australia to change the way it thinks about poverty, including allowing the government to set and measure an official poverty line. Social services say Australia should follow in New Zealand's footsteps by recognising the effects of poverty on children and passing legislation to measure and eventually hope to resolve the problem.
Josh isn't like most high school students. He's given a TED talk and advocates on youth issues across the nation, but he also misses out because he's living in poverty.
I sometimes either stay up a bit later than most thinking about this exact topic and how to best support my family. I sometimes take up jobs outside of the home just to make sure that the family can get by.
That's on top of helping care for his 10-year-old sister, who has a number of complex medical needs and requires round-the-clock care.
Yeah.
The family gets a carer's pension, but Mum Laura says it's not enough, even if things seem okay.
They may look at us from the outside and not realise just actually how tough and how much stress and budgeting and thought and everything, planning perhaps goes into making sure that my children are fed and clothed.
Come on, Shasha, let's go collect the eggs.
It's estimated about 1 in 6 children are living below the poverty line, but we don't know exactly how many. Josh and his mum are supporting a campaign run by End Child Poverty, calling for Australia to legislate a commitment to measuring the problem and ending it.
It places an accountability on government, but more importantly, I think it keeps the Australian community informed. Currently, the Australian community has no idea what child poverty is like in this country.
While countries like the US, Canada and New Zealand all have government-measured poverty lines, Australia doesn't. Research for the campaign from the Australia Institute shows 4 in 5 Australians support the government regularly reporting on poverty and lifting income support.
Poverty is a policy choice. These are things that can be addressed. We know how to do them. It requires a will, but if we're not even measuring it, then it makes it very easy to hide it.
New Zealand introduced similar legislation in 2018.
It's really important because it ensures that ongoing focus is there for successive governments. It means that it doesn't slip out of focus when issues of the day come up.
Social Services Minister Amanda Rishworth didn't answer questions about the idea of similar legislation in Australia, but she says the Commonwealth has committed $200 million to help local communities reduce disadvantage in their areas. Laura wants to see payments increased and a pledge to measure poverty.
We're not going to have an idea as a nation how we are actually tracking. And I feel like by the government not doing that thus far, it's very, very easy to just pretend that there is no issue with poverty.
With inflation still running hot, it's an issue unlikely to shrink anytime soon. Ken Burke, ABC News.
So that was a story from one of our ambassadors whose family home burnt down last year. Those kids have been through a lot, and their frame of poverty has also been the relationship poverty, the lack of support from community, and having simple things for them to have. So that report we released with the Australia Institute on July 15. We've got today's webinar. We are prepping for Homelessness Week next week. On Thursday, we're bringing together frontline workers from Perth to come together and tell us about what's going on with children experiencing poverty. We'll be developing a report from that workshop to use as advocacy to send to government. We're also releasing the Bankwest Curtin Economics Report, which is the HILDA data of children experiencing homelessness and the wellbeing measures of how children are experiencing that homelessness. So happy to share that. And we'll be launching Sharon's report with some media for the campaign for that as well. We're looking for some events for September, so we're wide open if anyone wants to do anything with us in September. And then we'll be getting ready for Anti-Poverty Week, where Sharon will be, and the crew there are releasing their full report for their more research. And we will be doing, I've got a typo there, we'll be doing a partner webinar for all of our partners who have signed up, so the 107 plus by then, we hope. And then in November, we want to fly Sharon over. So if anyone would like to donate to some airfares for Sharon to come to Western Australia, we'll be doing an in-person launch and getting Sharon around Perth to do a politics in the pub and meeting with some politicians over here, of which Patrick Gorman is the Assistant Minister to the Prime Minister. We have Anne Alley over here as well, and to speak with our state government. So if you want Sharon to come to your state, she's available with her schedule. I'll just let you talk to Sharon about that. But definitely in Canberra. We want to do an event in Canberra. I know Ron's talking about that. And please, we want to contribute to more policy data and research so that we can get the stories out. This is the research that the Australia Institute did for us and found that 4 in 5 Australians support the Commonwealth government to regularly measure and report poverty rates. But more interestingly, 1 in 5 Australians agree that income support payments should be set at a rate that does not cause children to live in poverty. So we know the electorate is supporting this. We know this could be a vote turner at the next election, maybe not this one, but definitely at the next election. And now we want to just build partnerships. We wanted everyone to get involved, call us, develop local groups. We're looking to kind of get this campaign structure going. So if you're an organisation that can run the campaign from your state, please do. We're running it here in Western Australia. Now we're looking for organisations to run it locally within their state and territories, and cohort groups and corporate groups. That's when we'll start our advocacy and policy work. And we need money for polling. We need money for events. We need money for communications so that we can do our political strategy. And this is where the proceeds will go. So we've got our badges, we've got our stickers, we've got core flutes, graphic design. We might do some advertising for the campaign, voter research, polling, events, work summits and seminars. So these are the things that we've got lined up. We're looking for very many more things to do for the campaign. survey with the State School Teachers Union is something that we're going to do, and service sectors, more policy roundtables to develop actual policy of what's going on in communities, and parliamentary friends. So, like we said, this is a campaign that is built on a moral and necessary, and sometimes it's really hard to find the word, but we have to do this. This is it. We have to do this. It's unacceptable that we have child poverty in this country, and we're looking for that 500. So please help us get there. If you have any questions, please let us know.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to all of the presenters today for a wonderful webinar. Catholic Social Services Australia is one of those 107 supporters that Sarah mentioned. And apart from the fact that it's an absolutely vital campaign and project that they're working on, one of the reasons that we joined immediately when Tony got in touch is because we could see these people are very serious about this campaign, and Sarah and the leadership group are very serious, and this campaign is going to be a success, and it's going to be a great force for change in Australian society. So we encourage everybody on this webinar to become a campaign supporter and to encourage your networks to also join. And I'm looking at the chat, and I don't think there's actually any questions. There's a lot of information being provided there by Carolyn and Julie and Anne, I think. So I want to say thanks once again to Tony, Sharon and Sarah for wonderful presentations, and thank you for your participation in staying on this hookup for over an hour. That's fantastic, and we look forward to working with you all in the future as the events and studies continue and the momentum and power of the campaign will build. So thanks very much, everyone.